I've always thought of the library as a living thing. It breathes in whispers, exhales silence, and wraps itself around you like an old quilt. The creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of worn pages, the golden light streaming through tall windows, they feel like home to me. My name is Claire Evans. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 10 years, I've been the head librarian at Willow Creek Public Library. Most people in this small Texas town don't know much about me. They just see the woman behind the counter, the one with her hair in a loose bun, and ink smudges on her fingers. To them, I'm quiet, polite, maybe a little too serious, and that's fine. After all, life has taught me to keep my head down. Every morning begins the same. I unlock the heavy oak doors at 8 o'clock sharp. They groan like old men stretching after a long night. I flip the sign to open and take a moment to breathe in the stillness before the first visitor arrives. There's a sense of ritual to it all. Straightening chairs, dusting shelves, aligning the spines of books, until they stand at perfect attention. Today felt no different. A Tuesday morning in early spring. Outside, the sun was warm enough to make the air shimmer on the sidewalk. Inside, the air was cool, still carrying the faint aroma of yesterday's rain. I walked the aisles with my clipboard, noting which titles needed repairing. A copy of To Kill a Mockingbird sat open on a table, forgotten. I smiled and closed it gently, tucking it under my arm. At the front desk, I poured myself a cup of coffee, cheap and slightly bitter, but comforting in its own way. The clock ticked softly above my head. 8:15. A retired teacher shuffled in first, as she did every Tuesday, clutching her tote bag filled with crosswords. Then came a young mother with a baby in a sling, and a toddler tugging at her hand. I greeted them all with warm nods, my usual smile. In moments like this, the world feels simple, manageable. For a few hours each day, I can pretend the outside chaos doesn't touch me. The overdue bills waiting at home, the tight knot in my chest that never fully goes away, the echoes of a marriage that ended with more silence than words. Here I have control. Here I am enough. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life has a way of shattering the illusion of peace when you least expect it. That morning, as sunlight danced across the reading room floor, I had no idea that my voice, small, steady, and almost always calm, was about to cut through the air and freeze this entire room. I didn't know one sentence would change everything. But then, you never really do. The door opened with an abrupt clang, startling me enough to spill a little coffee on the desk. He stepped in like he owned the place, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored navy suit that looked absurdly out of place against the library's faded linoleum floors. The faint smell of expensive cologne followed him sharp and cold, cutting through the warm scent of old books. I'd never seen him before, but I didn't need an introduction. This was Robert Kane. Everyone in Willow Creek knew his name. The man who built shopping centers where mom and pop stores used to be. The billionaire with his face on magazine covers, and a reputation for making people disappear figuratively, at least if they got in his way. His polished shoes clicked across the floor. Heads turned as his presence rippled through the room, like a stone thrown into still water. Even Mrs. Collins, our unflappable retired teacher, froze mid-page and peeked over her glasses. "You," he said, his voice deep and commanding eyes locking on me like I'd personally offended him. "You're the librarian here." "Yes, sir," I said, setting my coffee aside and straightening my name badge. "Can I help you?" He strode forward, placing his leather briefcase on the counter with a heavy thud. I need access to the archive room. Now. I hesitated. The archives weren't open to the public without prior approval. Sir, we do have a process for accessing the archives. If you fill out a request form, I don't have time for forms, he snapped, cutting me off. His voice carried bouncing off the high ceilings. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. This is a matter of urgency. I expect you to cooperate. I glanced toward the reading tables. A mother was whispering to her little boy to stay quiet. Mr. Green was gripping his newspaper a little too tightly. I understand it's important, I said calmly, though my palms had begun to sweat. But access requires 48 hours for approval. It's library policy. He leaned in slightly, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. Do you know who I am? I swallowed hard. Of course I did. Everyone did. But policy didn't bend for anyone, not even billionaires. Yes, Mr. Kane, I know who you are, but the archives hold rare documents, and I'm not authorized to. This is ridiculous, he barked, slamming his palm on the counter so hard the sound echoed through the room. Do you have any idea how much money I've poured into this town? You'll open that door for me, or I'll find someone who will. Silence blanketed the library. Even the clock above my head seemed to hold its breath. I stood there, heart pounding in my ears, every instinct telling me to back down. But some stubborn part of me refused to let him bulldoze over me, no matter how much power he carried. And though I didn't know it yet, that small act of defiance would set the entire room on edge and draw the attention of a man sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the right moment to step in. I don't wait, Robert Kane said, his voice dropping lower, but sharper like a blade, pressed just close enough to draw a bead of blood. He leaned his elbows on the counter, looming over me. I could feel the weight of his presence, the way his eyes bore into mine, daring me to flinch. Sir, I began, keeping my tone steady. Our archive room isn't open to walk-ins. It houses rare documents and fragile materials. Access requires a request form and a 48-hour approval process. It's to protect Spare Me, the speech he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. This is not a debate. I need those files today. Not tomorrow, not in 48 hours. Now. The word cracked across the room like a whip. Behind him, a young mother froze mid-step, holding her toddler's hand. At a corner table, a college student glanced up from his laptop. Even the rustle of pages seemed to stop. Sir, I don't have the authority to break protocol. His jaw tightened. Authority. Do you know what authority means? Miss Evans. He straightened up, adjusting the cuff of his shirt like he was preparing for battle. Authority is when a man like me walks into a building and doors open without question. That's authority. That's respect. Respect isn't automatic, I heard myself say softly. His head snapped toward me. Excuse me. I swallowed hard instantly, regretting letting the word slip. What I mean is, respect is earned, sir, and library policy applies to everyone equally. His face turned a shade darker, and for a second I thought he might shout. But instead, he smiled a cold, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. You've got some nerve. He tapped the counter twice with his index finger, each knock louder than the last. You have 10 seconds to open that archive room before I make a call to the mayor. Do you really think your job is worth losing over a locked door? My stomach twisted. I thought of the bills waiting on my kitchen table, the rent due in 5 days, and the little boy asleep in his room back home. The logical part of me whispered to give in to unlock the door and avoid the fallout. But there was another voice, too, a quieter, steadier one, reminding me why I had taken this job in the first place. Libraries were about fairness, about protecting knowledge, about standing up for what's right, even when no one else would. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kane," I said, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. "But I can't help you." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Robert's smile vanished. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice like ice. I didn't respond, but in the back of the room near the history section, a man in a worn leather jacket slowly set down the book he'd been reading. And for the first time, I noticed his quiet, watchful eyes fixed on us. His hand came down on the counter with a deafening smack, making me flinch despite every effort to stay composed. The sound cut through the library, like a gunshot bouncing off the high ceilings, and shattering what little calm remained in the air. "I could buy this pathetic place and fire you on the spot." Robert Kane's voice thundered sharp and venomous. Every head in the library turned now. Pages stilled mid-flip. A pen rolled off a table and clattered to the floor. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate, its ticking suddenly too loud in the silence that followed his outburst. I felt my chest tighten as heat crawled up my neck. My hands curled into fists at my sides to stop them from trembling. "Sir," I said softly, willing my voice not to shake, "there's no need to raise your voice. This is a public space." "A public space," he repeated, laughing bitterly. "Do you have any idea who I am? I own half the properties in this county. I fund the mayor's campaigns. I've built towers in cities 10 times this size. And you think you can stand there and tell me what I can or can't do?" Behind him, the young mother hugged her toddler close, murmuring for him to stay quiet. At the far corner, an elderly man pushed his glasses up his nose, eyes wide as he watched the scene unfold. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares pressing against my skin, but I didn't move. "I'm just doing my job," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please lower your voice. You're disturbing the other patrons." That seemed to ignite something in him. His hand slammed the counter again, harder this time. A few people jumped in their seats. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled. "People like me don't wait. We don't ask. We take what we need. And if you think your little rules are going to stop me, you're in for a rude awakening." The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. For a heartbeat, I thought about apologizing just to diffuse the situation, to keep my job, to protect the fragile peace of this place I loved so much. But something deep inside me refused. This wasn't just about a locked door anymore. And as I looked up at him, his face red with anger, his chest heaving with self-importance, I felt something shift. I didn't know it yet, but in the shadows of the history aisle, a man with steel-gray hair and a calm, steady presence was about to stand and speak, and his voice would bring the entire room to a halt. I stood there staring at Robert Kane's reddened face, his jaw tight with fury, and for a moment my vision blurred, not from tears, but from memories clawing their way back to the surface. This wasn't the first time I'd been spoken to like this. I was 21 when I got my first job as a cashier at a grocery store. The manager, a balding man with too much cologne, used to bark orders across the floor, snapping his fingers when he wanted my attention. "You're lucky to even be here," he'd say, when I asked for time off to study for exams. And I believed him. I thought gratitude meant swallowing my pride and forcing a smile. Years later, I thought I'd escaped all that when I married Derek. At first, he was charming, funny, attentive, the kind of man who knew how to light up a room. But it didn't take long for his words to turn sharp. You think you're better than me because you read books." He sneered one night after I suggested we sit down and make a budget. I stayed longer than I should have. By then, we had a baby boy, Ethan, and I told myself it was better for him to have two parents under one roof, even if I felt like I was suffocating. But I remember the night I packed my bags. Ethan was 5. Derek had come home late, reeking of whiskey, and slammed the door so hard the picture frames rattled. I pulled my son close and whispered, "We're leaving." I found us a 1-bedroom apartment across town. The kitchen was cramped, the wallpaper peeling, but it was ours. For the first time in years, the air felt breathable. Since then, I'd told myself to keep my head down and work hard. For Ethan, for the rent, for some sense of stability. But standing here now with Robert Kane towering over me, I felt that same familiar pressure, the urge to shrink, to apologize, to avoid conflict at all costs. My son's face flashed in my mind. 7 years old now, bright-eyed and curious, always asking questions about the world. What would he think if he saw me back down to a bully like this? My hands unclenched slowly. I straightened my spine. No, not this time. My fingers brushed against the smooth leather of the book resting on the counter, a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. I'd been repairing earlier that morning. The worn spine felt solid under my touch, grounding me as Robert Kane's voice thundered in my ears. "Do you even understand who you're dealing with?" He barked his words, slicing through the stillness like a blade. "I could crush you with a single phone call. People like you. You're replaceable. Replaceable." The word rattled around in my mind like a pebble in an empty jar. For years I had believed that. I'd convinced myself that keeping quiet, being agreeable, and never making waves was the only way to survive. For Ethan, for the little life we'd built in our tiny apartment. But now, as I watched this man puff up with his own importance, something inside me hardened. I wasn't 21 anymore. I wasn't the young woman afraid to speak up to a boss who snapped his fingers. And I wasn't the wife who held her tongue while her husband chipped away at her spirit night after night. Not anymore. The weight of every moment I'd stayed silent pressed against me now, and with it came a heat rising in my chest. Not fear this time, but resolve. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I looked up at Robert Kane. He was still talking, still tossing his power around like it was a weapon. But I wasn't listening anymore. All I could hear was Ethan's voice in my head the night before Mom. Why do people act mean? Sometimes I didn't have an answer then, but maybe I could find one now. My fingers curled tighter around the book's spine until my knuckles whitened. Slowly, I drew in a breath, steady and deep, and let it out in a way that calmed the trembling in my chest. I was done shrinking. I was done being the woman who let people like Robert Kane walk all over her. Today, I would not be silent. I could feel every pair of eyes in the library on me. The weight of their stares pressed in like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Somewhere behind me, the clock ticked each second, dragging longer than the last. Robert Kane leaned across the counter, his cologne sharp in the air between us. His voice was low now, but no less venomous. "I'll say this one more time. Open the archive room, or I'll make sure you're never hired anywhere in this town again." For a split second, I thought about the consequences, about the rent due in 3 weeks, about my son's sneakers, the soles already worn thin, about the thin envelope of cash I kept tucked inside a cookbook at home, every dollar hard-earned. But then I thought about every moment I'd stayed quiet in my life. Every time I'd swallowed my pride, forced a smile, and let someone else walk over me because I didn't think my voice mattered. And something in me snapped. I straightened my back, lifting my chin just enough to meet his eyes head-on. The tremor in my hands stilled. My voice, when it came, was calm, steady, louder than I'd expected. "You can own every building in this city, sir." I said the words sharp but measured. "But you'll never own respect." The sound carried across the room and seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, the world went silent. The young mother froze mid-step, her toddler clutching her leg and staring wide-eyed. A student at the corner table let out a quiet gasp before clapping his hand over his mouth. Even Mr. Green, our most unflappable regular, stopped pretending to read his newspaper and stared. Robert blinked at me, his mouth parting slightly, as though he couldn't quite process what had just happened. I didn't move. I didn't look away. The silence deepened. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press against your eardrums, thick and heavy, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. For the first time since he'd stormed in, Robert Kane didn't have an immediate retort. And in that fragile, frozen moment, I felt something shift, not just in the room, but deep inside me. Behind us, a chair scraped softly against the floor. I turned my head slightly and saw a man standing near the history section. He was tall, broad-shouldered with silver hair and a worn leather jacket. He'd been sitting quietly for nearly an hour, his presence barely noticeable until now. His gaze locked on Robert's back, calm but unflinching. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the room like a command. "That's enough." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made even Robert Kane stiffen. All eyes turned toward him. And for the first time all morning, it wasn't me who felt the pressure of the room's attention. Robert Kane's face went red, then pale, then red again. For a moment I thought he might explode right there at the counter. "You," he sputtered, his voice quivering with rage as he jabbed a finger at me. "You don't talk to me like that. Do you have any idea?" He cut himself off and stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the oak floor. The smell of his cologne and anger clung to the air like smoke. His shadow stretched across the counter, swallowing the leather-bound book I still held in my hands. "People like you are lucky I even stepped foot in this dump," he seethed. "I could bulldoze this whole building tomorrow and put up condos. I could—" "That's enough." The voice came from behind him. Calm, low, but with a weight to it that silenced the air. Robert froze mid-step. His head turned slightly as though he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "That's enough," the voice repeated, slowly. Every person in the library looked toward the history aisle, where a man had risen from his chair. He was older, perhaps, in his mid-50s, with broad shoulders and silver hair that caught the sunlight filtering through the tall windows. His leather jacket was worn at the elbows, but it hung neatly on his frame. His boots, though scuffed, were polished clean, and his eyes sharp, steady, and cold as steel were fixed squarely on Robert Kane. "Who the hell are you?" Robert demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he spun around. The man didn't flinch. He stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured and deliberate. "A man who's had enough of your noise," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but something about it carried deep commanding, the kind of tone you didn't ignore. The library seemed to shrink around us. Even the clock on the wall ticked quieter. "I don't know who you think you are." Robert started trying to regain his bluster, but the man cut him off. "You don't need to know who I am," he said. "But I know exactly who you are." For the first time since he'd stormed in, Robert Kane hesitated, And in that pause, in the heavy silence of a room filled with watching eyes and held breaths, I saw something I never thought I'd see in him: doubt. The man stepped fully into the light, now his boots soundless against the hardwood floor. He carried himself with a quiet authority that needed no introduction, no raised voice, no swagger. His presence alone seemed to press against the walls of the library, filling every corner with a stillness that was almost electric. "I asked you a question," Robert Kane said, though his voice was softer now, stripped of the force it had carried seconds earlier. The older man stopped a few feet away from him. He wasn't tall in an imposing way, but there was something about his posture, his squared shoulders, his level gaze, that made him feel larger than life. "My name is Alexander Ward," he said simply. "Retired 4-star General, United States Army." A small, almost imperceptible shift passed through the library. The young mother holding her toddler stiffened slightly, as though recognizing the name. Mr. Green adjusted his glasses and gave a slow, knowing nod. "But Robert Kane—" He laughed. It wasn't a full, confident laugh, more like a bark to cover his unease. And Robert asked, forcing his voice to steady, "You think that means something to me? You're not in the army anymore. This isn't a battlefield. This is business." Alexander's expression didn't change. He clasped his hands loosely in front of him, tilting his head ever so slightly, as if weighing his words. "In my line of work," he said, his voice even, "and deep respect isn't given. It's earned." The words seemed to hang in the air, quiet, but undeniable. "And right now, Mr. Kane," he continued, taking a single step closer, "you're losing it." Robert opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. His jaw tightened. His shoulders twitched as if he were about to puff himself back up, but then his eyes darted around the room. Every person in the library was watching. The student at the corner table, the retired teacher clutching her crossword, even the little boy in his mother's arms, staring with wide, curious eyes. For once, Robert Kane wasn't the most powerful man in the room. Robert's face flushed deep crimson, a vein in his temple pulsing visibly. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, knuckles blanching. "Who the hell do you think you are?" He spat, his voice louder now, echoing off the high ceilings. Alexander Ward didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His expression stayed calm, almost unnervingly, so like a man who'd spent decades staring down threats, far more dangerous than an angry billionaire in an over-tailored suit. "I think," Alexander said quietly, "I'm someone who knows the difference between power and respect. You clearly don't." A ripple passed through the room. Someone in the back shifted in their chair. The young mother hugged her toddler closer, eyes darting between the two men. "You don't talk to me like that," Robert barked, pointing a shaking finger at Alexander. "I could buy your whole damn life and not even feel it." Alexander stepped forward, closing the space between them by a few feet. The movement wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, steady, and it carried more weight than any amount of yelling could. "You've bought buildings, Mr. Kane," Alexander said, his voice low but cutting. "You've bought influence. You've probably even bought people. But you can't buy dignity, and you sure as hell can't buy respect." The words landed like a hammer blow. For a long moment, Robert just stood there, chest heaving. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for anyone to back him up. But the room was silent. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, none offering the validation he craved. The tension was so thick, it felt like it could shatter if anyone so much as breathed too loudly. Then with a sharp exhale, Robert's face twisted into a sneer. He grabbed the manila folder he'd been clutching, then slammed it down onto the counter so hard the sound made me flinch. "Fine," he growled. "Keep your dusty little library." He turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his polished shoes striking the floor in sharp, angry beats. Before stepping outside, he paused just long enough to throw his final words over his shoulder. "You're all a bunch of nobodies, and don't think for a second this is over." The door slammed behind him, the sound reverberating through the room like an aftershock. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Alexander turned his gaze to me. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice softening in a way that caught me off guard. I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and nodded, though my hands were still shaking. I think so," I said quietly. The door clicked shut behind Robert Kane, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I let out a shaky breath. My fingers loosened their grip on the edge of the counter, leaving behind faint, crescent-shaped imprints in the wood. The room remained quiet, as if the walls themselves were still holding their breath. Then slowly, a murmur rippled through the patrons. A chair scraped against the floor. A page turned. Someone coughed. Life cautiously crept back into the library. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart still pounding like a drum. That was, I whispered to myself, unable to find the right word. Intense, I looked up. Alexander Ward stood just a few feet away. Now his hands relaxed at his sides, his steel-gray eyes softer than they'd been a moment ago. Up close, I noticed the faint lines etched around his eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting in harsh sun and smiling sparingly. Yes, I admitted, my voice low. Intense is a good word for it. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "I think so," I said, though. My hands were still trembling slightly. "You held your ground well," he said. "Not everyone can do that with a man like him breathing down their neck." I gave a small, tired smile. It didn't feel very brave at the time. "Bravery rarely does," he said simply. For a moment, we both stood in silence. Behind us, the library had returned to its normal rhythm. A toddler giggled softly in the children's section. The clock above the desk ticked steadily on. "I don't think I've seen you here before," I said, my voice still a little unsteady. "Are you visiting Willow Creek?" He shook his head. "No. I've been coming here for a few months now. I usually sit back there in the history aisle." I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "I'm sorry. I guess I didn't notice." "That's all right," he said. "I tend to keep to myself." I glanced at the spot where he'd been sitting earlier. A book still lay open on the table, a leather jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair. "What were you reading military history?" he said with a faint smile. "Old habits." That's when it clicked. The calm authority. The way he'd spoken to Robert without raising his voice, but still commanded the room. You're the general," I said quietly. He gave a small nod. "Retired. A long time ago." "Well," I said softly, "thank you for stepping in. I didn't know what would have happened if you hadn't." His gaze held mine for a moment, steady and warm. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind a man like that he doesn't own the world. And though he spoke in that deep, even tone of his, there was something almost kind in it, something that made the knot in my chest loosen just slightly. The tables near the front desk were still skewed from Robert's outburst. A few chairs toppled over where he'd shoved past them. I bent down to straighten one, brushing away the faint coffee stain he'd left behind. My hands felt steadier now, though my chest was still tight with the echo of everything that had just happened. "Let me help with that," Alexander said. Before I could protest, he was already lifting a chair with one hand and adjusting a table with the other. There was an ease to his movements, not rushed, not forced, just deliberate, like someone who had spent his whole life moving through chaos with calm precision. "You don't have to," I said softly. He glanced at me with a small smile. "I know, but I want to." For a few moments we worked in quiet tandem. I noticed how careful he was, how he paused to make sure a chair didn't scrape too loudly against the floor, as if he understood the sacredness of the library's quiet. When the last table was back in place, I stepped back and took a long breath. "Thank you," I said again, "for everything." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small plain card. Holding it between 2 fingers, he extended it to me. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice as steady as before, "call me." I took the card and turned it over in my hands. On it was his name, Alexander Ward, and a single phone number, nothing else. The cardstock was thick and smooth, the kind you don't see much anymore. I looked up at him. "I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," he replied gently. "It's not in my nature to step into someone's life unless I mean it." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The warmth in his tone, so at odds with the sharp authority he'd shown earlier, settled somewhere deep in my chest. "I'll keep that in mind," I said softly, tucking the card carefully into the pocket of my cardigan. He nodded once. "Good." As he turned to gather his jacket from the history aisle, I caught myself watching him, not just his broad shoulders or the quiet strength in his movements, but the way the air seemed lighter in his presence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it, and I didn't yet know why. But a part of me hoped this wouldn't be the last time I saw Alexander Ward. Alexander came back 2 days later. It was early morning, and I was restocking the new arrivals shelf when the door creaked open. A rush of cool air followed him in, carrying the faint scent of pine and coffee. He was holding 2 cups, one in each hand. "Good morning, Miss Evans," he said in that steady, even tone of his. I blinked surprised, and quickly set down the books in my arms. "General Ward," I said, feeling a small smile tug at my lips. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Just Alexander," he corrected gently, walking toward the counter. He extended one of the cups to me. "Black with a little sugar." "I wasn't sure, but you strike me as someone who likes her coffee straightforward." I laughed softly and accepted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my cold fingers. You guessed right. After that morning, he began stopping by more often. Sometimes he'd bring coffee, other times a bag of fresh scones from the bakery across the street. He never stayed too long, just enough to check out a book or ask if I needed help, lifting the heavy boxes of donations that had been piling up in the back room. "You know you don't have to do that," I told him once, as he easily hoisted a carton labeled reference books onto a high shelf. "I know," he said, giving me that quiet smile of his, "but it's good to keep busy." We started talking more in those little in-between moments. He asked about my son Ethan, and listened carefully when I spoke about him. In return, I learned fragments about his life. He'd served for over 30 years, rising through the ranks, until he wore 4 stars on his shoulder. After retiring, he settled in a quiet house on the edge of town. He didn't speak much about his time in the military, just enough to let me glimpse the weight he carried without ever putting it on my shoulders. Sometimes when we weren't talking, We'd just work side by side in companionable silence. There was something soothing about his presence, something steady and grounding, that made the library feel even more like a sanctuary. I didn't realize it at first, but little by little I found myself looking forward to his visits. One evening, as he reached for his coat, he paused and said, "You know, Miss Evans, it's been a long time since I've met someone who listens the way you do." The words caught me off guard. "I could say the same about you," I replied softly. He gave me a slow nod, as if filing the moment away for later. And as I locked the library doors that night, I felt something unexpected bloom in my chest. Not the usual anxiety about bills or the weight of single motherhood, but a small, quiet warmth. For years, I'd built walls around my heart, high, thick, and unyielding. They were the only thing that had kept me from falling apart after Derek left. Love. I decided back then was a risk I couldn't afford. Not with a little boy depending on me. Not with bills stacked on the kitchen table, and exhaustion clinging to my bones like a second skin. But Alexander Ward was different. It wasn't just the way he spoke, measured and thoughtful, as though every word carried weight. It wasn't even the quiet strength in his eyes, though I noticed that too. It was how he made me feel safe. I realized it one Saturday afternoon when Ethan was with me at the library. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the children's section, flipping through a book on space. I was behind the counter, sorting through a new donation of novels, when the door opened. Alexander walked in, carrying a small brown bag from the bakery. The moment Ethan saw him, his face lit up. "Mr. Ward," Ethan called, scrambling to his feet. Alexander's lips curved into a rare, warm smile. "Hey there, soldier," he said, crouching down so he was eye level with my son. They'd only met once before, briefly, when Alexander had stopped by, and Ethan had been too shy to say much. But now Ethan ran to him with the kind of unguarded trust only a child can give. Alexander pulled a chocolate chip cookie from the bag and handed it to him. "I figured you might need some reinforcements for your space mission," Ethan giggled. "Thanks. Mom says sugar makes me hyper, though." "Well," Alexander said with a mock-serious tone, "I trust you'll use your energy for good." I watched them from behind the counter, my hands stilling on the stack of books. It was such a simple moment. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic. And yet something inside me shifted. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a man speak to Ethan like that. Like he mattered, like his words and his little boy laughter were worth listening to. When Alexander eventually stood and met my gaze, there was no judgment there, no impatience, only quiet understanding. And in that moment, the walls I'd built around my heart didn't feel quite so tall anymore. A week later, a cream-colored envelope arrived at the library. My name was written in bold, slanted strokes on the front. There was no return address, but the weight of the paper alone told me who it was from. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, my fingers brushing against the expensive stationery. "Claire Evans. I owe you an apology. My behavior that morning was inexcusable toward you and everyone else in that room. I let my frustration get the better of me and acted like a man I don't recognize or respect. I'm sorry. If you can forgive a fool, I'd like to make amends by donating to the library's restoration fund. It's clear this place means a great deal to you. And now it means something to me too. Robert Kane." I folded the letter carefully and set it down, staring at the neat signature at the bottom. For years, I'd believed that men like Robert Kane didn't apologize. That power didn't bend. That people who yelled and demanded and threw their weight around never stopped to consider the wreckage they left behind. But I had been wrong, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud. Not because I'd won some battle against a man like him, but because I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't given in. The old me, the one who stayed quiet at the grocery store, when her manager snapped his fingers, the one who bit her tongue at home. To keep the peace, she would have apologized just to make the moment end. But she wasn't here anymore. I wasn't her anymore. I was stronger now. Not unafraid, I'd probably never be unafraid, but strong enough to hold my ground. "You're quiet," Alexander said from across the counter. I looked up and found him watching me, his eyes calm but curious. "I got a letter," I said softly. "An apology from Robert Kane." Alexander raised a brow. "Did you expect that?" "Not at all," I admitted. "But I think it means something." "Maybe it means you reminded him what respect looks like," Alexander said. I smiled faintly. Maybe. As I tucked the letter away, I realized it didn't really matter what Robert Kane thought. What mattered was that I had spoken up, and in doing so, I'd found my own voice again. And sitting here in the quiet sanctuary of my library, with a man who understood strength in all its forms, I realized I was ready for the next chapter of my life. The library was quiet again, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Ethan was sprawled on the carpet in the children's corner, flipping through a book about dinosaurs, his little legs kicking idly in the air. Alexander leaned against the counter hands in the pockets of his leather jacket. There was an ease about him I hadn't noticed before, like the sharp edges he carried had softened over the past few weeks. "Claire," he said after a moment, his voice low and warm. I glanced up from the stack of returns I was scanning. It's supposed to be a clear day tomorrow. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Would you and Ethan like to join me for a picnic out at Willow Park?" A picnic. The word felt almost foreign to me, light, easy, uncomplicated. I couldn't remember the last time someone had invited me anywhere without strings attached. I looked over at Ethan. His face was lit with wonder as he traced the teeth of a T-Rex on the page, completely unaware of the question hanging in the air. "Are you sure?" I asked softly. "We wouldn't be intruding." Alexander shook his head with a faint smile. "Not at all. In fact, I'd be grateful for the company. It's been a long time since I've shared a quiet afternoon with good people." Something in his words made my chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. I glanced back at Ethan again, then to Alexander. "All right," I said, finally a small smile tugging at my lips. "We'd like that." He nodded, his smile deepening slightly. "I'll bring sandwiches. Any requests?" "Anything but peanut butter," I said with a quiet laugh. "Ethan tends to wear more of it than he eats. I'll keep that in mind." As I watched him leave a few minutes later, Ethan running to the window to wave goodbye, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. And as I turned off the library lights that evening, locking the doors behind me, I caught myself whispering under my breath, maybe respect and love aren't so different after all.